Hello, I'm John Platoff. There are so many reasons to love this wonderful Mozart piano concerto. Today I'm going to talk about just 6 of them, beginning with the unobtrusive start of the movement. Quietly in the strings we hear a unison 2-measure motive of no particular distinction, and we hear it twice. Why do we care about this? Because Mozart's craftsmanship and creativity enable him to reuse that motive in a variety of ways throughout the movement. Here's the first forte passage, only 20 seconds into the movement, and you'll hear as the whole orchestra plays the same motive now underneath the texture. Here's yet another example of how Mozart employs the same 2-bar motive. We hear it in 1-bar imitations, bouncing back between tonic and dominant. Here's yet another example, also using the same 1-bar imitation, but adding the piano to the texture and beginning a sequence through the circle of fifths. From the very beginning of the concerto, Mozart reminds us of the power of the woodwinds and brasses to create a completely different color. Here's the same unobtrusive opening we heard earlier, but after 6 bars, the flute, oboes, bassoons, horns, and trumpets and timpani come in with a quiet fanfare, and the color changes entirely. There are many other examples throughout the whole concerto of the woodwind color being used for a variety. In this passage we hear woodwinds answered by strings in 2-bar alternations. And here's a different example. In this case we have the woodwinds and the piano in dialogue. A hallmark of Mozart's music, and of late 18th century music in general, is its clarity and accessibility. The listener can follow along easily without having to work hard. A big part of that accessibility comes from music that's predictable. Mozart and his contemporaries wrote phrases and passages where it's as though the composer shot an arrow and you knew where the arrow was going to come down and when. We hear that in several passages where Mozart makes delightfully predictable lead-ins to cadences and new sections. Listen to the 8-bar passage that leads to the cadence here. Here's another example that does exactly the same thing. We pause on the dominant, and then in 8 bars we glide gently back into the return of the main theme. Any listener would have the delightful pleasure of knowing what was going to happen and when it was going to happen, and then being proven right. So Mozart's predictable, except when he's not. In this passage we heard before, 2 bars in the woodwinds are answered by 2 in the strings, then 2 again in the woodwinds, and when we think we know what's going to happen, Mozart writes a passage for the strings that takes 7 bars to reach its cadence. Here is an absolutely spectacular example of Mozart playing with our expectations of predictability. This is my very favorite passage in the entire concerto, and it was the starting point for my idea to make this video. At 2 sections in the movement, the piano works itself up to a climactic passage, closing with a trill and leading into a loud orchestral tutti passage. The first time, Mozart does it in just the predictable way that we would expect. He takes 8 measures to reach the 1-6-4 chord, and then there's a 6-measure exploration of the 1-6-4 going to the dominant 7th and then resolving in the tonic. Here's that passage. It's when the same passage comes back later in the movement that the magic happens. We hear that same 8-bar preparation for the 1-6-4 chord, but there's a 9th bar put in there. And the result is like when you hand an ice cream to your little niece, but you pull it back at the last minute and she has to reach for it. And then when the 1-6-4 chord is reached, instead of 6 bars to play out the resolution to the tonic, Mozart writes again another 9 bars, and our expectations are stretched and stretched and stretched. We know exactly where it has to go, but for the first time we don't know when we're going to get there. That passage just
absolutely
kills me. So that's why I'm making this video, is that passage. So far we've been talking only about the first movement of the concerto. Let's move on to the slow movement. Here's the theme played by the solo piano. It is beautiful and serene and expressive. There are 2 balanced 3-bar phrases, followed by a feeling of expansion, a pair of 2-bar phrases in rising sequence to a 1-6-4 chord, and then relaxing into a beautiful, equally serene cadence. It's a lovely theme. But of course, as many of you know, this is not actually how the movement begins. The movement begins with the orchestral version of the same theme. We hear the same 3-bar balanced phrases and the rising sequence to reach the 1-6-4, and then anguish, agony. We hear a minor 1-6-4 chord and a series of dissonant, painful, jarring suspensions. Listen especially to what the bassoon is doing, as in measure after measure, it insists on holding a painfully dissonant note. This is one of the most anguished passages in all of Mozart's music, before it then resolves, sadder but wiser, back to the major and to the cadence. It's an extraordinary theme, and it's followed then by the serene, untroubled version of the melody that we heard a moment ago from the piano. And for the rest of the slow movement, the serenity plays out shadowed by unexpected eruptions again of these anguished moments. It's a uniquely passionate, complicated movement in Mozart's music. And now we've reached the absolutely delightful final movement, which begins with this playful theme. There are so many other delightful passages in this movement. I want to talk about just one of them, where we see Mozart combining virtuosity with subtlety. We hear a bouncy theme played by the woodwinds, then repeated by the piano. After that, the pianist takes off in a virtuoso run of perpetual motion sixteenths, and the bouncy theme is played by the woodwinds above that. What you'll hear, if you listen carefully, is on the offbeats of the woodwinds, the strings stick their noses in, so that there's a bouncing back and forth between woodwinds and strings, all on top of what the piano is doing. It's subtle and fantastic. This concerto by Mozart has delighted audiences for 240 years. Today we've talked about 6 of the many reasons why that's so. I hope you have a lot of joy in getting to know this concerto better and enjoying the rest of Mozart's music as well. Thanks so much for watching.